Our first seminar speaker today is Dr. Wulfila Gronenberg. He's a professor here of neuroscience at the U of A. Dr. Gronenberg completed his education in Germany. He did his bachelor's and his master's both in biology, and then he did his PhD in zoology. He came to Arizona here to the U of A as a postdoc in 1988. And then he took on the role as a research scientist and then started as an assistant professor here in 1991. And as I mentioned, he is a full professor now. Dr. Gronenberg studies the neuronal control of behavior using social insects like wasps and ants and bees and sometimes spiders. And he has authored more than 80 publications in his field and has served as a reviewer for more than 40 different publications. And so I am very excited today to welcome Dr. Gronenberg here.
Thank you so much, Jennifer, for inviting me and also for the introduction. There may be some overlap with what I'll have to say. I'll just share my screen. Okay, so I'll talk about brains and insect brains and the brain size. But before I do that, I'll just have a few words about my background. I mean, Jennifer just mentioned that, but I'll have a few, 2 or 3 slides to give you an idea. Let's see. Okay, so I got interested in chemistry actually in high school. And so this is me here in 8th grade in Germany, in Berlin. And in chemistry at school, but also at home, I would do little, things that boys like to do, that smell and explode and so on. And then I started studying chemistry here in Berlin. But then it turned out it really wasn't for me so much because it was different from just making smelly and exploding things. And then I switched to studying biology at a different university in Berlin. And as Jennifer said, I did my master's there and also my PhD. And for my PhD, I was working on bee brains and on information processing in bee brains. So this shows you a bee mounted with the head open. You can see the whitish stuff here is the brain, and there's an electrode going in there to record activity in neurons. And then this is one particular neurons that I had recorded from and then stained afterwards in a honeybee. And then I was sort of set for a career in academia, and a typical career then in academia. Then you, after you get your PhD, you do what's referred to as a postdoc. And I did my first so-called postdoc in Germany and in Frankfurt, working in a lab where they worked on spiders. And so I was working on the brain and information processing in the brain of spiders. And then I did another postdoc, and I actually came here to Tucson. And I was working in a lab where they were working on flies and flight control and vision in flies. And again, I did similar kind of work, recording activity of neurons in the brain and how they are related to flight control and to vision. And then I went back to Germany for a longer period to Würzburg, and there I was interested in ants. And actually, I learned about ants. I had no idea about ants, but then that was an ant lab, not a neuroscience lab. They were more behavioral biologists and ecologists. But at the time, there was very little that was known about ant brains, and so I started working on ant brains, and I enjoyed that. And then when I was looking for permanent positions, I actually came back here to Tucson, as Jennifer just said, and established my own lab. In the beginning, it was called the Arizona Research Laboratories Division of Neuroscience, and then later, about 8 years ago, we became an actually part in the Department of Neuroscience. And I'm working on bees and ants, but also on wasps and on spiders and these creatures that are called whip spiders. Okay, and with that, I'll come to the topic of brains and brain size. And obviously, animals come in all sorts of sizes and then cover a large range of sizes. And this shows you some mammals and a large mammal, an elephant, and its brain here, and a tiny little insect This one is so small that you can barely see it with your naked eyes, but it also has a brain just like an elephant does. And these are some mammalian brains, and you probably know this is human brain, that we have particularly large brains, but we do not have the largest brain in the animal kingdom. So an elephant or whales or larger dolphins do have larger brains than we do. But for our body size, we do have the largest brain. And as I just sort of indicated, the size of the brain correlates with the size of the body, and that is shown here. This is, people have been working on that for 100 years, and this is just one example for mammals. On the x-axis here is the body size on the logarithmic scale, the body weight, and on the y-axis is the brain weight or the brain mass. And so we are here for this particular body weight. We have this particular brain size, and you see the line here is sort of the average of all of those. And then the individual brains and animals vary a little bit around this regression line. And we are, in a way, particularly far away from the regression line here, which means that for our body size, our brain is very large. Okay, the same is true for vertebrates and in general, and this is shown here. Again, this is from a large study looking at many papers that have been done over the last 100 years. And each of these dots is an animal and its brain size. And up here, so the larger animals among the vertebrates obviously are the mammals. So the mammals are up here, birds are up here, and then here you have amphibians and reptiles and fish down here. And again, you see some dots are above the line, which means these have relatively large brains. That's true for birds and for mammals. And others have relatively smaller size for their body size. And that's true for fish and amphibians in particular. Now, brain size, as I said, has been worked on for quite a bit by many different people and labs. And it's of interest because it's correlated with behavioral capacities or intelligence in humans or in, let's say, in monkeys and so on. And that's why so many people are interested in brain size. But it's also correlated with ecological conditions, of course, because the environment in which an animal lives may also affect its behavior and brain size. Okay, so just as a background, why people are interested in that. And as you've seen, I've been interested basically for all my career in invertebrates animals, and I was interested in figuring out how does the brain size correlate with body size in insects, because there are so many data in invertebrates, but there were no data really in insects. Some qualitative data. This, for instance, is a large beetle, a stag beetle, one of the largest beetles. And here compared to a honeybee at the same scale. Now, if we look at the brains, the stag beetle has a relatively tiny brain compared to a honeybee. So even though the beetle is much bigger, the honeybee has a bigger brain. And that would suggest something, that maybe honeybees have a somewhat more complex behavior or have to deal with more complex situations. And here, many of you may know Drosophila, fruit flies, and this is a picture superimposed the head and the brain of a fruit fly, and again you see that the brain is pretty large. It fills a major part of the brain is large, fills a major part of the head, and here the same for a beetle and pine beetle, a pest insect on trees, and so this then is the beetle, and in purple the central nervous system. This part here would be the head. And so you see that the brain is much smaller. It takes up a much smaller amount of the total head volume compared to a fly or to a bee. Again, beetles are not as behaviorally advanced in a way as are some other insects. They invest more in basically having a very hard cuticle and being protected from predators rather than using their brain to and then complex behavior. Okay, so as I said, we were interested in looking at insects, and we chose this order of insects that's called the Hymenoptera, which are the bees and the wasps and the ants. And we had a large range of body sizes. So those of you who live in Tucson, you probably know these very large, beautiful wasp tarantula hawks. They were among our largest samples. And then you all know honeybees, and you have an idea about how big they are. And then we also had many different ant species. This is a relatively small one, so at the same scale as the tarantula hawk or the honeybee, they would be this size here. So this is enlarged. And then again, I mentioned earlier this tiny little fairy wasp, which is the smallest insect. And here it's compared to a unicellular organism. So these tiny little insects, they are as large as a single-celled organism, and yet they have a totally functioning brain. They can fly, they can feed, they can mate, and so on. To me, this is quite amazing how that such tiny little brains exist. Okay. So these are the insects that we have been looking at, the different genera, and I don't want to go into detail. These are just some examples. And the blue dots here indicate the body size, and the red dots indicate the respective brain size, but at a logarithmic scale. So this dot may be 10 times as this one, but that means that in reality, the body would be 100 times as big. Okay, and now some data. So the first thing that we found by comparing the body mass and the brain mass is this data set here. Each of these dots is one individual insect, and then the regression line, it looks similar to what I showed you earlier for the vertebrates. And in the next slide, I'll bring those two together. So this is what you saw earlier, and I just put them onto the same graph. So down here are the insects, and up here are the vertebrates. And the blue dots are the wasp and bees, and the green dots are different ant species. And if you look at all of them together, it looks like the insects, they perfectly fit onto the same line, and that would suggest to us that basically the same sort of rules apply to brains of vertebrates and insects, and perhaps the entire animal kingdom. So there's, in a way, there's nothing special really about insect brains, other than that they are smaller, just like the insects themselves are smaller. One thing that we found was that the ants have smaller brains than those other Hymenoptera, the bees and wasps, and that's shown here in red are the ants, and you see they are basically below the blue dots, even for the same body size. So an ant of this body size, we also had small bees and small wasps that were the same size as ants, and in all those cases they had larger brains than the ants, and I'll come back to that in a second. Now, many people, as I said, have been measuring brain size for a long time, but really what is in a way more important is the number of neurons in the brain, because, and I make this analogy to computers, an early supercomputer in the 1980s, it took a whole room full of computing stuff. So this is the actual processor, and these back here are the benches full of storage, tape, magnetic tape, and this computer. Computer people, they measure the capacities or capabilities of a computer in a measure that's called flops. So this computer had about 2 gigaflops, and your cell phone, a recent cell phone, a smartphone, has about 1 teraflops, which means it's this. So the latest iPhone is 500 times more has a 500 times higher processing capacity as this gigantic computer, and so the same really applies then for brains. There are some animals like this sea slug. They are relatively basal, of course, but they have good-sized brain, or it's not as compact. There are several ganglia, but if you put them all together, it's a good size. And when we compare that to those fruit flies that I mentioned earlier, the entire fruit fly is much smaller than the brain of this marine slug, which is the size. I mean, it can be like 2 kilograms. So it's called a sea slug, and it is almost as big as a rabbit. And compared to that, the fruit fly is much smaller than its brain, and yet the fruit fly in its tiny brain has about 100,000 neurons, whereas this large animal has only 18,000 neurons in its much bigger brain. And that's why really the number of neurons is maybe more important. And I think I'll skip that, but it just shows you this is a section for a mouse brain, and each of these little reddish dots is one nucleus. This is enlarged here, this part here, and you see each of these blue dots are one nucleus, and you can imagine it's a huge amount of work to count the number of neurons even in a mouse brain, and for that reason, until recently, there were very few good numbers available. And then this lady here, Susana Herculano Rosel, originally from Brazil, she came up with a different way of counting neurons. And I'll not go into detail, but in her first studies, she was working at rodents, and she had a broad range from a small mouse to golden hamster to a rat, guinea pig, and a agouti and a capybara. So capybara are the largest rodents. They're almost the size of a pig, and so this shows you the overall difference in body mass. So the capybara is whatever 1,200 times as big or as heavy as a little mouse. Now for the brains, the brain of the capybara is less than 200 times as big as that of a mouse. And now the cell count that this scientist brought into the play, it turned out that the capybara just has 22 times as many neurons as the mouse, even though it's more than 1,000 times as big. And again, that points to the significance of really the cell, the neuron numbers, because it's probably more related to behavioral complexity or intelligence or computational power. Anyway, so we followed this method that this researcher came up with for vertebrates, and we tried to use it on our insects. And it took us a couple of years to get it going, because obviously insect brains are much smaller. But then we came up with good data. So this is a relatively large ant that you can find all over Tucson here, and this is its brain, or a section for its brain. And all the cyan teal little dots are the nuclei. So they have been stained with a fluorescent tracer. And for I'll not go into detail for the counting. But basically, this shows you the individual homogenized nuclei in a microscope on a counting grid that's used in the medical field for counting blood cells. And we use it for counting these nuclei. And by using this technique, we then came up with this following data set. So these are the nuclei or the cell or the neuron numbers plotted over the brain mass. So earlier we had the body size and the brain mass here, and now here we have the brain size or the brain mass and the number of nuclei. And again, we get those relationships. And you see here in red, the ants are again a little bit below the other insects. So they have smaller brains, relatively smaller brains, and also relatively fewer neurons, which for the people who work on ants, like I did, was sort of unexpected, because we think they are highly intelligent and so on. But anyway, this is what we found. And then again, when we put that on the same graph that was available for data from vertebrates, only birds and mammals are the vertebrates where these cells have been, the neurons have been counted. And then when we compare that, again, there's a pretty good fit with the cell or neuron numbers in insects and in vertebrates. And here in the middle, there's a gap, because no fish have yet been analyzed, but I would assume that just like for the overall brain size, the neuron numbers will also be similar for their respective body size. And so again, this suggests that the differences are that there are not big differences in the design of brains. Let's say in the overall design of brains between vertebrates and invertebrates. And I mentioned that ants have smaller brains, and I'll show you why. I'll give you an example here. So this is an image of a small bee. You'll find those actually around this time of the year here in Tucson on flowers. They're much smaller than honeybees, and they are beautiful metallic green. And this is a relatively large ant, and these two are similar in body size, and that's why we can compare them so easily. This is a section to the head of this bee, and this is a section to the head of this ant stained. And you can see in the bee, the brain is very large, and in the ant, it's relatively smaller. The ants have more muscles because they bite more. But what is important here is I have outlined in blue, that may be hard to see, but this area here, this is the visual part of the brain. So bees and also flies and other flying insects have very large visual centers in their brain. And also the eyes. I mean, if you just look at the eye here or here and compare it to the small eyes of a typical ant, that's the major reason. So in the ant, the visual centers are tiny. And the reason is that ants, or at least ant workers, they do not fly. And for flying and flight control, you need a huge amount of very, very fast visual processing to be able to steer your flight and not bump into something. Ants don't have this problem, or these worker ants, and so they can afford a smaller brain. And you should know that brains are expensive in metabolic terms. They are as expensive as muscles, and so you'll never have an animal with a larger brain than it really needs. You know, my last just one more minute. We've also been comparing social and solitary insects, and among these Hymenoptera, there are many social, so insects that live in colonies like honeybees or paper wasps that you may have in your backyard, or these leafcutter ants. All ants are social; they live in colonies, compared to solitary insects that may look similar, but they don't live in colonies. So we have compared the brains, and here the blue dots are the solitary ones, and the red dots are the social ones. And I did not do the statistics because we didn't really have enough data to do a proper statistics. But just looking at it, it does not look like the blue dots or the solitary ones are lower or have smaller brains than these social ones. That was one of the questions that people in the field of social insects had. They always think their social insects are so super and so smart. That may not be the case, actually, and these data would support that. And the same here for the number of neurons. Again, in red, the social ones, and in blue, the solitary ones. And again, it does not look like social insects have more neurons in their brains than solitary ones. If at all, then the opposite may be true. And I think with that, I'll come to an end. So I showed you that the comparison between insect and vertebrates brain body size looks pretty similar, that the same rules may apply. Ants have relatively smaller brains than the other insects, and I think the reason is that they don't fly and so don't need quite as much fast visual processing. And then social insects do not seem to have more neurons or larger brains than solitary insects, and that's something that's more for the specialists who are interested in social insects. And I think that I'll stop here. Much of this work has included quite a number of undergraduate students, because for the cell counting, we needed a lot of help. And this is a graduate student. All the other students that you see here are undergraduate students. And here we are on Mount Lemmon, collecting all sorts of insects and also some spiders. And then here are more just the names of other students that I didn't have pictures for. Okay, and with this, I thank you very much and answer questions.
Thank you so much, Dr. Gronenberg. If you have a question, go ahead and raise a hand and we can find you. How about Zach?
Sure, thank you. That was a fascinating talk. One question that I had has to do with the comparison between the social and solitary insects. Is a plausible sort of explanation for why we might see fewer like neurons per mass unit in the social insects, that they can sort of rely on one another in their colonies to kind of fill in gaps in like whatever brain power they would need?
Yes, that's a perfect idea. And actually, that's what we think. Until I would say 15 years ago or so, when not so much was known about social insect brains, people actually thought that social insect might have more brain power, and that was based on findings in invertebrates, in particular in primates and humans, because we have big brains, we are social, and we are so smart. That was the background. And for a long time, people thought that something similar might be true for social insects. But as you just said, it's just the opposite, because social insects, they don't rely on the individual brain power, but the power of what social insects can do comes from the colony. They sort of share the brain power of hundreds of thousands of individuals in one colony, and that's why they can do all the interesting things that they can do. Yeah, that's a very good idea. Thank you.
Sure. And actually, if I could do one other follow-up question with that, have you guys at all looked into like comparing the queen bee or whatever sort of like leader member of the social colony, their brain size or neuron count compared to the other?
Yeah, well, we have not done that. Nobody has done these cell counts yet. We just put out this paper and we sort of asked other groups to start using this method. But there's evidence about the brain mass, or the volume at least, and queens typically the brain size, I would say, is similar to the workers. The optic lobes and the eyes may be bigger, and that makes sense because in many social insects the queens have to fly typically only once in their life, but to mate. And the males, they have much smaller brains, because males are they don't have to do anything in the colony. They're fed by the workers, and then on one particular day they fly out, find a female, mate with her, and die. And so they don't need much brain power. And I see Vivian is smiling. I'll not draw any correlations to humans, but that's the way it is in social insects. Okay,
awesome. Thank you.
You're welcome.